Hi, I'm James Lamont, fellow at the Vidine Center for Rural Economic Development at the University of Minnesota Crookston. Today, we are going to have a small business supply chain disruption series discussion regarding what's happening in the world with various logistics networks and supply chains, how it's impacting small businesses across northern Minnesota, as well as other parts of the upper Midwest, and kind of what to expect over the next several months, years, etc. Unfortunately, many of you are here because you're experiencing supply chain challenges, which are impacting your ability to meet customer demand. Perhaps it's driving up cost to the point where you're unable to continue passing it on to your customers without them going somewhere else. And for some of you, you're at the point where you're trying to figure out how to stay in business, just given the rapid decline, if you will, of various supply chain networks that are impacting your small companies. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through a brief PowerPoint presentation where I'm going to discuss the various attributes associated with what's happening across the world. After that, we're going to go through some SBA risk mitigation training, which I think would be of value for you. There are concurrent live sessions that will be held in both Thief River Falls as well as Crookston. And at some point over the next several months, we'll likely have a course at Bemidji. One other thing I'd like to offer you is if you have any questions concerning the material, specifics regarding a supply chain that's impacting your particular company, etc., feel free to use the Vidine Center for Rural Economic Development at the University of Minnesota Crookston. We are a resource for rural economic development, and we would love to work with you, the SBDC, as well as other institutions to figure out how to best serve your needs as a small company. So let's start talking about what happened. When COVID kicked off, the laboratory, or if you will, workshop of the world, China, pretty much shut off for about 6 to 8 weeks. So all of the containers that were coming eastbound from, East Asia into West Coast ports suddenly came to an extreme halt. Right away, didn't just impact the exports associated with Chinese goods to the United States, but it also impacted all of the containers that we needed here in the United States to move products westbound. While that was occurring and the virus began to spread in North America and Europe, we immediately noticed shutdowns in the United States, mostly in critical areas that impact manufacturing, agriculture, energy, as well as other critical sectors of the US economy. So suddenly you had a shutdown in China. Then you had transportation issues moving into the United States. Then you had a shutdown in the United States. And then as all of this is happening in a very highly sophisticated and curated just-in-time manufacturing environment, the virus started to impact supply and demand, really demand profiles in the United States. So for example, restaurants, schools, and every other large user of various agricultural products, suddenly demand declined 95% because there were massive closures across the country, yet demand would spike in supermarkets, right? And so the supply chain, which was geared toward moving things via wholesale markets, suddenly found itself incapable of responding to a peak in retail demand while everything else saw a major decline. So all of these things are happening at once within about a 6-month period. And naturally, as one can imagine, that 6 months then led to the last 24 months, which we'll talk about in depth because there have been various shifts as well impacting your ability to manage your supply chain. So let's talk about how the sort of global shipping world works. In the top right-hand corner of the slide, there are approximately a dozen points of contact for the average good that arrives in the United States. So in Europe or the United States, someone will likely define or design the intellectual property, whether it's small electronics, semiconductors, something to do with ag tech, whatever the case is, the design is likely to happen in the West or the industrialized world. Same thing with the software design. You'll see that, subsequent to the actual engineering of the product, the software design will occur in the United States or Europe or something to that effect. From there, this could happen over 4 or 5 different companies, right? So you may be designing one component of a larger component, which then feeds a larger system, if you will, but it is likely decentralized in a way that this information is being designed and or developed across multiple places in the United States and or Europe, or back and forth even. It's not even an or, it could be and. Um, from there, the equipment to develop that specific piece of whatever widget we'll call it is also designed in Japan, the United States, an industrialized country in Europe, etc. So again, the equipment and design scattered across the industrialized world, and then the materials, or at least the super sophisticated materials, are likely mined and or produced also in, say, the United States, right? So then you may have a Japanese or a European casing or some type of augmentation to that piece that is then, and we're on materials, which is step 5 and 6. So right up front, steps 1 through 6, there are probably more than a dozen points of contact. And they're going back and forth depending on where they are in the process. From there, the actual manufacturing occurs, and you'll notice that the manufacturing occurs primarily in East Asia. That could be Taiwan, Malaysia, Indonesia, China, South Korea, even Japan. And the key is, like manufacturing that was outsourced in the 1980s in the United States from what is now deemed the Rust Belt. Everything got sent to either China or Mexico or something, places where labor was much cheaper. But now you're finding that companies in Mexico and China, where the standards of living have increased, are outsourcing a good portion of their development to countries further south. So if you're China, you're looking at Indonesia or Malaysia. If you are Mexico, you're looking at El Salvador, you're looking at Nicaragua, Guatemala, etc. Why? Because you as a middle broker can make more money because standards of living are a little lower in those countries, therefore wages are lower. So in effect, you've got this massive manufacturing sort of cluster that's happening, which also relies almost exclusively on being in time. Then you've got the sales that are occurring to customers primarily in the industrialized world, right? So you've got the wholesalers, the retailers, et cetera, because you get a premium in the industrialized world because wages are 8 to 10 times higher than the developing world. Throughout this whole process, you're moving goods, intellectual property, intellectual capital, and services all over the world. So these dozen touch points or points of contact could be 3 or 4 dozen, depending on how far down the OEM is willing to relegate a specific piece of design or manufacturing. And now imagine COVID hits, it impacts every single node. And the interesting thing is each of these points of contact on the map are impacted likely at a very different time. So China was first, then you saw massive issues in the United States, subsequently Europe, and then it swung back to Asia, and then we were doing better in the United States, and then we had a peak again, then Europe subsided, then Europe peaked, and then the Middle East peaked, and then the United States peaked again with Omicron. So the point being, at any point within this particular process, there's an impact by COVID. Simultaneous to all of these issues on the supply side, you have a demand shift. Not only do you have a demand shift over the first few months because, well, you don't need to go to restaurants or go back to the ag example or, schools or whatever, but now you've got a retail run on supplies. Then, since a year transpires where you may not have purchased a car, or you may not have purchased a home, or you may not have purchased a good or asset that would follow one of these dozen points of contact, suddenly you've got pent-up demand. And so the demand goes sky high and skyrockets. The supply chain still hasn't caught up. And then while all of this is happening, the federal government in the United States via the US Federal Reserve, as well as Congress, as well as European counterparts, are pumping economies full of money. In fact, it's estimated the US economy was pumped with over $9 trillion of either Federal Reserve programming or liquidity or federal stimulus. So $9 trillion in a $22 trillion economy or so, that makes a huge difference. You're augmenting pent-up demand. You've already got supply chain constraints. And so what happens? Well, prices of everything goes up. And on top of that, shipping rates, because the world is so now convoluted and shipping containers are everywhere, shipping costs go through the roof. As you can see on the bottom right-hand corner, global shipping costs surged in 2021. The bottom line up front, throughout 2020, the constant cost for a 40-foot shipping container was about $2,000. Typical prices were anywhere from $1,500 to $2,000, which was pretty normal, right? Maybe a little lower than normal. But by midsummer 2021, that container cost was over $20,000. So suddenly you find a 10x cost just for the container to move your good and service, or move your good. So as a result, you as the buyer, small company for the materials, are now experiencing the spillover effects, or the cascading impact of the cost of a container. Now that price has since gone down, and as I sit here, it's probably anywhere from 12 to 13,000, sitting here in late February, early March of 2022. But here's the issue. The issue is it's still very difficult for suppliers to access and gain consistent supply of containers to move their products. This doesn't include other issues either, right? This is just the shipping container. So one issue you may have read about in the newspaper or saw on the news is our ports are congested. So here in the United States, whether it's Long Beach, Seattle, Tacoma, if it's Canada, it's Rupert or Vancouver. Subsequently, you've got ports in the East Coast, but most of us are impacted by the West. What you'll notice is doubling, the wait times for shipping containers have doubled. You may have seen like flotillas of shipping container vessels off the coast of Los Angeles or Long Beach, really, where, wait times, they're waiting a month to move their product from the ocean into the port. Like they're literally just sitting there. And then on top of that, you've got a massive shortcoming or shortfall of trucking capabilities in the United States, or transportation capacity, due to the fact that we have a very large deficit in truck drivers right now. So we have fewer truck drivers, much higher requirements, congestions at ports, plus the inability to get a shipping container. So it's not uncommon to wait, 8-9 months for a good that you've ordered, because it may get stuck either off the coast of the West Coast of the United States. It may get stuck, in a shipping yard waiting for a truck driver to come get it. It may get stuck regionally in a regional hub. It just, anything can happen. So that's how we arrived here. About 2 years after the pandemic hit, this is kind of the state of play. So here's the thing, when it comes to your company, you've obviously already experienced major supply chain disruptions, but the purpose of this training isn't to tell you about what happened. It's to help give you an understanding of what happened, but it's also to prevent you from hopefully encountering any more risks, or at least mitigate the risks you likely anticipate within your respective supply chain. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how to identify these supply chain risks, and maybe methods that you can mitigate or your exposure to those risks. So as you've correctly identified, we don't want to wait till this already happened. Now, none of us could have anticipated COVID. None of us could have anticipated the supply and demand shocks that happened as a result. And none of us could have anticipated $9 trillion worth of liquidity being pumped into the US economy, thereby resulting in further exacerbation of these issues. So let's talk about maybe some of the risks you may encounter financially if you are dependent on goods and services that come from abroad. First and foremost, understanding financial risks. So the US dollar, given sort of the $9 trillion of liquidity, is experiencing some turbulence. You may have picked up on the fact that we're probably operating somewhere between 7% and 9% inflation, depending on which gauge you use. And as a result, that gives us less purchasing power in a global market, because the dollar since inflation is going up, is declining in value. Right away, if you can get ahead of this, you're going to want to look at it from the prism of, okay, we have a financial risk here. Maybe I need to take on more safety stock, or maybe I need to take on, a different approach to where I get my supply from, because maybe you can go somewhere where they've had equally as bad, or if not worse, inflation, like Turkey, which would give you a competitive advantage. Same thing with tariffs. Right before COVID kicked off, the United States was engaged in a multi-front trade conflict with Europe, with China, with other countries across the globe. And so as a result, these tariffs also added premiums to the costs associated with the goods sold in your respective industries. Then you've got the geopolitical issues. Good example would be, here I am sitting here talking to you on day 4 of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. Why that's important to our region? Well, 2 reasons. One, Ukraine is one of the, if not the largest, it's among the largest wheat producers on planet Earth. And 2, there are some energy imbalances that are going to impact European markets, thereby creating further constraints and input costs in the United States, given global trading of energy resources. So we've got to look out for geopolitical turmoil as well. Then we need to look at overruns. These are likely internal risks to yourselves, but also there may be cost overruns that get passed on by your suppliers. And given sort of the supply chain environment and logistics environment right now, it's not unlikely that they could use that to their advantage and then sell to someone else that's willing to pay a higher cost. So understanding sort of these financial risks and understanding where you originate most of your supply from could help you offset future risks by understanding what's happening in that region, and or maybe looking at different places to trade based on sort of the purchasing power parity you have with the dollar. Same thing with delivery schedules. Excuse me. You have to frequently ensure that they're within scope. Make sure the people you're dealing with aren't trying to, gather and deliver upon other elements that, they're trying to upsell you, or maybe they're trying to work on, servicing 10 different customers and you'd be at the expense of, sort of those scope creep areas. So make sure that those who you're working with are able to deliver to you within scope of your contract. And then you're going to want to track the supply side risks. This is super important. Going back to sort of some of the financial risks, it's the same concept. Are there new variants that are emerging there? Are there other issues that could potentially impact your access to supply, et cetera? Okay, moving on. How to protect your company. So to protect your company, information is power. Having an understanding of your inventory is critical. So you're going to want to invest in some sort of inventory management system. Not all of us are going to become Walmart, where you can just have just-in-time data up and down the vertical, 10, 12, 18 different data collection points from warehouse to shelf, et cetera. But have a basic inventory management system so that it can trigger indications or warnings in the event you're likely going to encounter a problem. Same thing with that inventory management system. May be capable of providing real-time information and predictive analytics. That is something that could be very critical. Excuse me. The danger of doing a recording. Sorry, I'm stuffy. All right, so having real-time information at your disposal and predictive analytics will help you identify some of those risks up and down your supply chain vertical. Another area you're going to want to look at is diversification of your suppliers, vendor management. I know it's difficult because you're 2 years in, but you're going to have to continue some sort of geographic distribution or hedging of those suppliers. A good example would be going back to the coronavirus or COVID-19. If you were geographically distributed in terms of your diversification of suppliers, one area may see an increase or peak in Omicron or whatever, whereas others didn't, and then the ones that didn't were able to continue producing some of your supply. Or given the war on the Ukraine now, There are some Eastern European challenges associated with accessing goods and services. If you have geographic diversification, you can then grab from other suppliers in different parts of the world that don't have the current geopolitical or wartime risks. Another thing you're going to want to look at is using basic risk management principles. So we're going to go through risk management after this with the SBA workbook, but really understanding risk. And that's something that people frequently don't really have a good grasp of what it is and what it means to your company. So we're going to talk about understanding your highest areas of risk and then how to monitor those areas as well as possible. And then enable you potentially to become more proactive. Moving away from paper-based purchasing is also a critical element. This is kind of going back to the investment of technology, because again, it'll flag indications and warnings, and then sometimes even give you ideas as to where you can move into so that you can potentially access a more secure supply chain channel. And then one thing that you need to remember is cash is king in this environment. So the more you can get cash, the better, because if you have cash, you're able to basically outcompete your peer group. So if you're working on a net 30, net 60, net 90, you may want to truncate that period in terms of when you get your payment from your customers. Somehow accelerate your collection from customers so that you can have accumulation of more cash. This could be dangerous too, because we're working right now in an environment that has severe inflation, at least severe by American standards. So you want to be able to balance that risk as well in terms of having cash available at your disposal, so that again, you can outcompete others, because you might be able to pay a little bit more, but by paying more, you may have access to a product that potentially you've been out of for some time. So cash is king, understanding risk, diversification of suppliers, and inventory management. In addition to that, there are some other supply chain sort of attributes you can adopt. Maybe work customer service ahead of cost, meaning it could be more expensive. You might, especially given today's wage inflation and the cost of hiring people, but if you could offer better customer service than some of your peers, this could be super invaluable during times of crisis. Take a step back and think about your suppliers for a moment. Those that have been able to provide excellent customer service, even if they haven't been able to deliver, they've kept your mind at ease, they've kept you updated, et cetera. And there's a high probability you're more likely to go to that supplier given the investment that they made in your peace of mind via better customer service. So the same concept applies to your customers. Also develop and retain relationships with strong suppliers. The reason why is if they know your face, they're more likely to help. So by having that relationship with them, and that, which is critical, just like when, in your communities, people may shop at your hardware store, they may shop local for a reason. They know your face, they feel comfortable with your customer service. It's the same concept for you with your suppliers. So if there's a way you can somehow improve that relationship, do it. Also develop metrics to measure quality of your supplier's performance. Sometimes in small business world, you don't collect and capture that data. This is why an inventory management system can be very helpful, because after a while, you may have a feeling that something is wrong, but you really don't know because you can't quantify it. But by being able to quantify it, you may be able to go back to your supplier and say, look, I love you, but over the last 6 to 8 weeks, we've had these 12 issues. But by having that quantitative data available at your disposal, you can have a much more effective conversation with them. And sometimes you may be able to realize a discount or something to that effect, which can help you upstream in terms of, not having to pass costs on to your customers, thereby making you more competitive. Understanding how to manage risk, which we're going to talk about. Using effective demand forecasting. I know safety stock can be very expensive for many of you, but if you think about the cost of inflation right now, having additional safety stock may not be a bad idea. I bought a piece of furniture 3 months ago or so, and it was weird. It was a Saturday, and I'm looking at this couch. First, the guy told me it's going to be 2 months before we can get the couch. Got it, no problem. But he said, but you're in luck. And I said, why am I in luck? And he said, because the prices you see in the showroom are 10% higher than what the prices are. And I said, well, why? And he goes, well, Monday, there's a 10% above, across every asset class in his furniture store, across the board, 10% hike. That's it. Just like the dollar stores, you know, they went from like $1 to $1.25. Everything just went up. And so it's the same with safety stock, right? Maybe you take on more safety stock before they do a 10 or a 20% increase hike across, you know, across the board. Maybe you work with one of your competitors. So I know that sounds counterintuitive. You guys go halves each on safety stock, something just to get you through this particular supply chain disruption. And then integrating your supply chain strategy with your business strategy, right? So if you can synchronize your customer service model with your supply chain model, that that function may create resilience that you have not anticipated from before. So you may want to look at how to synchronize and integrate various activities on the front end of your business model, as well as everything that supports it. So the big question, which nobody really has an answer to, but I'm going to take a shot at it, right? When is this going to be over? To be frank, I think we're going to continue seeing shocks for the next several years. I don't know if it'll be variant driven. I mean, there's always the potential that some new variant gets discovered and then suddenly everybody huddles again for 3 to 5 months, right? Or 2 months or 3 months, whatever the case is. But realistically speaking, in a world where the damage has already been done over the last 2 years, this is what I think is going to happen. Shipping challenges are likely going to continue. When you think about, if you recall the Suez Canal, where there was and that's Egypt, where there was a boat or a transportation barge that turned over. That one instance only lasted a few days, but it created a backlog of about 160 days worth of issues. So if one ship can do that to 160 days worth of supply moving from Asia to Europe via the Suez, as you can imagine, 2 years of supply chain imbalances will likely continue having quite the effect on the maritime shipping environment. Then you have container shortages. This is going to be around probably for a couple years. In fact, prior to the virus, we had container shortages heading especially westbound to Asian ports. Why? Because the rail lines and the shipping companies get paid more to move their containers faster to Asia so they can fill them up, move product to West Coast ports, get products inside the United States and immediately move it back without products. Plus, with the trade deficit, it made more economic sense. Problem is, you're now taking, 30 years worth of shipping patterns, and suddenly you're disrupting that in addition to disrupting sort of the up and downs of various supply chain verticals, either moving product out or importing it. Then there's the issue of staffing shortages. The Great Resignation, and we're seeing that happen drastically throughout the United States. Doesn't matter where you are, you're seeing staffing shortages. In the upper Midwest, those problems are particularly acute because we've had a demographic decline, especially in rural areas over the last several decades. So these staffing shortages are likely going to be with us for a little while, just given the supply of human capital versus the demand and the demographic patterns that we were encountering prior to the virus. And then inflation. This subject is hot for debate. I'm going to be a realist and tell you I think this is going to be probably for another couple more years. You can't pump $9 trillion of liquidity into the US economy and not expect it to react in a way like it's reacting today. So it's highly likely that inflation, especially for specific goods and services, where it's above 7 to 9%, take used cars, for example, that have gone up almost 60%. I think we're going to see some of those larger ticket items sort of mellow here, especially as interest rates rise as a result of the inflation. But for some of the smaller goods, unfortunately, I think inflation is going to be here for a while. Wage inflation, sort of a similar boat we're in, $9 trillion of liquidity. People had money in their pockets. They drove up the prices of everything around them. And subsequently, you've got a human capital shortage. As a result, wage inflation is likely going to continue to grow for the next several years as well. So unfortunately, it's not going to be unlikely to have to hire somebody for like $20 an hour just to get their foot in the door for a burger job or working at a hardware store. Like the days of paying folks 10, 12, $15 an hour are going to be in the rearview mirror here very soon if they already aren't in your communities. I expect further policy challenges. The Federal Reserve has its work ahead of it because it can't really cut access to cheap money because, well, that's what the US economy is addicted to, but at the same time, it's forcing inflation pretty fast and hard. So they're going to have some policy changes that could exacerbate the challenge, or it can make it worse in terms of the other direction if they come back too hard on the economy and then suddenly restrict access to cheap dollars. New variants, as I mentioned, I'm not an epidemiologist, but there's always the potential for various flare-ups and whack-a-mole, if you will, across the globe. And then the ebbs and flows of demand just based on sort of the new patterns we've observed. So the key takeaway here is it could be a while before the issue is resolved. So this, if you're attending the actual in-person training, what we're going to do is kind of share stories. I think the key is so that we can learn from one another, because learning from one another, I believe, will enable people to understand what others are going through, but also identify potentially some local solutions, because there are global and regional solutions, but then there may be some local solutions that folks can enjoy. And so if you're attending this remotely, unfortunately, you won't be getting this portion, listening to some of your peers, et cetera. So what I'm going to do is, as part of sort of the instruction here, I'm going to go through, this is the SBA Risk Management Guide for Small Business. And the reason why I wanted to go through it is I think it's important, as you leave this training, to understand just some basic tools that you could use to understand risk mitigation moving forward. Again, can't really rewind what's happened over the last 2 years. You're in a tough spot, and I recognize that. But at the same time, moving forward, maybe some of these tools may be viable for you. So the first thing I want to talk about when it comes to risk management is understanding competitive and market risks, right? So as I talked about in the first presentation, market changes are causing business to change. And it's extremely difficult, especially in small communities, right? Because we're not historically agile compared to some of the more dominant trends that happen on the coasts in the United States. So even our major cities like Minneapolis, Fargo, Chicago, et cetera, in our region, they're able to move quickly, but not as quickly even as some of the coasts, right? And then it gets even further challenging as you're in smaller communities, because you may not have access to the quantities of, supply. Going back to containers, if containers are moving to the coast, the shippers on the coast have first option of those containers, right? So that would be the example. Whereas when you come into inland ports, it's subsequently difficult. And then you get to small towns, and it gets even more difficult because you don't have access to what Fargo, Chicago, Minneapolis have access to. So market changes around us are continuing, and your competitors are continuing to advertise differently. Your wholesale costs are increasing, decreasing, and like I said earlier, understanding your market better, like going back to oil and gasoline prices that are listed in here, or going back to the challenge in the Ukraine. So if you're dependent on wheat to produce some sort of product, there's a high probability now your input costs are going to skyrocket because of what's happening there. So market changes are going to force just drastic decisions for you. So if there's any way that you can further research and further anticipate where your feedstock or your product or whatever is coming from, that will help you, because then you can source from different vendors or competitively source globally versus, say, in the areas you may have sourced from before. The other piece is, as I talked about a little earlier, employees, especially in the some of the less skilled labor positions, they're going to move for that $1 an hour. And it's difficult if you're a small business in a small town where you can't really hike prices too much, or your customers are going to walk out or they'll go somewhere else. But at the same time, I am not exaggerating when I tell you that $20 an hour by this summer for various low-skilled jobs isn't out of the question. The market forces in our region, not just driven by the 7 to 9 trillion of liquidity that I talked about from the government, but also the economic growth in, Western Minnesota as a result of what's happening with the sky high growth in North Dakota, whether it's two new value added soy crushing plants, new corn wet milling site up in Grand Forks, and the list goes on. Now you're competing, even though you're, within 50 to 100 miles of it, you're competing in that labor market. Then you've got the Fargo diversion and Amazon, and everybody's paying more and paying college and paying benefits. So you got to be super cognizant, not just of your employees, but the customers that are loyal to that employee. And maybe start thinking about developing relationships with those customers, et cetera, in the event that that employee goes and finds a better job somewhere, not better, but a higher paying job somewhere else. And then rent increases. I know everybody, even across rural America, you're seeing just drastic increases in commercial lease rates. And so this is likely something that's going to continue as an impact of or as a result of the supply and demand that you're encountering. Same thing with the business environment risks. You're going to want to look at those very closely. Probably not too many issues at the local level, but federally, a lot of things are changing, especially if you're dependent heavily on fossil fuels for your industry or various ag products. And the reason why I say ag products is environmental, social, corporate governance is starting to influence how these decisions are being made and how costly these goods and services are. So I'm going to move to page 11 of this book, and we'll talk about, the reliance on, your customers, products, and vendors. So do what you can to improve upon, your customer base. As I mentioned earlier, you're a small business, which means you're super agile, which means you could offer a customer experience that larger businesses are incapable of including as part of their customer package. So you're going to want to be focused on customers, focused on that service element, and focused on, again, trying to diversify away from the products and vendors that you've historically relied on, because you're in this training for a reason. There's a high probability products and or vendors aren't necessarily meeting the requirement at this time. So focus on providing better customer service so you can grow that customer base, but also improving upon sort of your geographic distribution of products and vendors. And then you're going to experience cash flow problems, just given the fact that you've got a supply chain right now that's just up and down, up and down. And so my recommendation would be to continue sourcing additional cash flow, and doing that through the acceleration of your particular billing cycles. Next, from a training perspective, is on page 14. Again, trying to have more than one supplier for your product. That could be very difficult now because maybe some suppliers aren't necessarily looking for new onboarding opportunities because they may have too many companies today. So maybe teaming up with some of your competitors in the region to have a higher volume might be an idea for you, because having a higher volume may become more attractive to other suppliers in terms of the volume minimums they have. Also look for vendors that have the best price and service, but be very careful because some vendors may not be legitimate. So use your local trade boards or your state trade offices if you're dealing with a foreign vendor to do searches on those particular vendors so that you can understand if they're a viable opportunity or not. And then having and maintaining the relationships associated with different vendors, I think, would be very helpful. So if you're in Minnesota, there's a trade office you can leverage for that. If you're in North Dakota, there's a North Dakota trade office. I would suggest maybe reaching out to them or your Department of Commerce or Minnesota Deed to find out if there are additional areas you could be sourcing using their databases as the customer of that particular government institution. Business continuity, having a business continuity plan. Usually we look at that for weather, but in reality, right now it's continuity for new customers, it's continuity for new suppliers. You may want to cross-train all of your employees as well, so that if one critical employee leaves for a higher paying job, at least everybody's trained across the board, and treating your employees as effective as possible is going to be something that helps you retain those customers. And then lastly, on page 20 of this guide, I wanted to go through the 8 key points for you to remember. Risk. Understand your risks. Risks now and risks tomorrow. Learn from the risks you've suffered from now over the last couple of years, and then also understand it from both an external and an internal perspective. Also begin to assess risks by various events that could impact your cash flow. So if there's another spike in the coronavirus, or if there's another supply chain disruption, those kind of things I highly recommend you do. So anticipating your risks is just as critical as understanding your risks. Then ensure that you're able to insure anything you can so that you can minimize your risk. So basically having insurance for various types of risks would be very helpful at this time. Granted, a lot of the virus-related risks haven't been covered by insurers. Develop a business continuity plan so that you understand, if X happens, we engage in Y. The strategies I talked about earlier, cross-training, understanding risk, continuity and contingency planning, and be honest about it. Really take a hard look at this and say, if this happens, this is what will likely occur with this cash flow situation or this particular situation involving employees, et cetera. Don't be afraid to seek assistance from others. The SBA, the SBDC, Minnesota DEED, North Dakota Department of Commerce, there are SCORE. There are a number of mentorship opportunities and resources available to you to seek assistance. And then also always have an exit strategy. I know that sounds difficult, but it's something you're going to want to look at very closely in the event something happens. So this, like I said, the live training is going to be much more two-way discussions in terms of specific situations so that we could talk about them and assess them and also maybe resonate with those in the audience, whereas this is sort of a one-way training. If you have questions, again, contact the University of Minnesota Crookston Vidine Center for Rural Economic Development. We'd be happy to walk you through some issues. Contact your local SBDC as well. I'd like to thank you for joining me today. It's been a pleasure, and best of luck given sort of some of these constraints you're undergoing right now. And if you have any questions, again, feel free to contact us, and thank you.